Moving on to what I consider to be a most important piece of clothing, shoes. What girl doesn't love shoes, right? In the earlier 16th century, shoes were more like bedroom slippers compared to modern shoes. So the soles could have been made either of leather or velvet, and they didn't have a built up heel to them. So that started to change in the late 1540s and 50s. They started to be made with a low cork wedge, which ran the length of the shoe and then was soled with leather. In 1595, the first warrant for making shoes with a high heel and arch appears for Queen Elizabeth. And since they were lightweight, the shoes were generally inexpensive, and you would wear through several pairs in an average year. In the 1560s, Elizabeth was going through about 40 pairs of velvet shoes each year. That's a lot of shoes. On the other end of the body, you needed something for your head. Women would always have their hair tied up in some sort of bun or braid, unless it was a really special occasion, like Queen Elizabeth left her hair down for her coronation. But most always, you would have your hair tied up, and then you would have something to cover your heads. So men would wear some kind of cap. For the wealthy, it would be made of silk velvet and decorated with ornaments. Most were made of wool, though. For ladies, headgear was generally made of linen, and for poorer women, could almost resemble a baby bonnet. Wealthier women would wear a similar style, but would decorate it with jewels. Then there were also the sort of hoods that we see in the portraits of Anne Boleyn, for example. It would have a stiff front decorated with jewels and gold to frame the face, and then it would have a soft back. In the 1570s, tall hats came into fashion, and there were a variety of fashions of headgear available. It actually made it really difficult to plan what kind of head wardrobe to bring to court because there was so much. And so you just didn't really know what was going to be in fashion that particular year, so you kind of had to guess. Jewelry, of course, was also really popular, particularly something called mourning jewelry, which might be a sort of ring, something that would say, "Remember me," for example. They might also be specific reminders of someone who had died. They would also just be used to remind the wearer that death was never far away and one should always be prepared. It was really popular to have jewelry set with skulls or skeletons. And that was a good reminder of how much you needed to keep on God's good side, really. Henry VIII had a gold ring set with a death's head. It's interesting to note with jewelry that many times the gemstones weren't even real. Some of Elizabeth's own pearls may have been fake ones made out of glass. And speaking of glass, glass with colored foil behind it was often used to imitate precious stones. The look of this jewelry is opulent and the style is very grand. Understated elegance wasn't really their thing. Men and women alike wore gold chains. Even the attendants of wealthy men would have great gold chains. The general idea seemed to be to wear as much jewelry as possible, and even items like buttons could be made with precious metal for really formal occasions when you wanted to show off. Jewelry could also be used for religious reasons, obviously, but in addition to things like crosses that would convey your beliefs, it could also be used to hide your beliefs. For example, once rosaries were outlawed during Elizabeth's reign, which we talked about on an earlier episode about Catholics, people used to wear these things called rosary rings, which had studs for prayer and could be used in the same way a rosary would be used. One of the funniest items of clothing I found was a jeweled fur, which was a small pelt of a small animal, which was made into a piece of jewelry. It was ornamented with stones and chains. Henry VIII had two made of sable, one of which had a clock set in its head and had paws of gold with sapphire claws. The other one was set with turquoise, rubies, diamond, and pearls, and it had a ruby tongue. Sounds so gross. They would be carried the way you would carry a pet or worn slung over your shoulder. In the show notes on the website, I have a link to a Pinterest board where there's a lot of examples on these jeweled furs, and they are definitely worth checking out. Keeping your furs looking good was really major work. One housewife manual from the end of the 14th century instructs the best way to care for furs. If your fur had become hard and stiff, you should sprinkle wine over it by spurting it from your mouth and then throw flour over that. Then leave it to dry for a day and rub it out. Not a lot of fun, if you ask me. It's clear that being fashionable at court, or really in any of the middle to upper classes in Tudor and Elizabethan England, was an expensive prospect, and many people incurred large debts to pay for their finery. It's not just modern people who have issues with credit card debt at Topshop or H&M. Not that I know anyone who has had that problem when she was just out of college 15 years ago, but I digress. If the whole point was to get noticed at court, then you had to shell out the money to make sure that happened. Take the case of Arthur Throckmorton, who came to court in 1583. He had to sell part of his land and borrow to fund his new wardrobe, and he was still paying interest on the loan years later. Of course, if you had a good career out of it, then it was a worthwhile investment. But just like today, if you go out and buy a bunch of suits for interviews and you spend a ton of money on designer clothes to make an impression somewhere and it doesn't get you anywhere, you could be ruined. One final note on clothing is cross-dressing. Of course, I take it for granted now that I can wear jeans and trousers, but obviously it wasn't always seen as appropriate. Just like it's still not particularly accepted for men to go around wearing skirts, although I have to say they are really much cooler in the summer, and I highly recommend it. In the theater, for example, women were not allowed to be on stage, and so young men and boys played the female roles, dressing for the part. This actually raised a lot of concerns about men potentially falling in love or having lustful feelings towards the boys and the young men. And then there were men who were playing women who cross dressed as a man, like in The Merchant of Venice, where Portia plays a man to act as a lawyer. Women would dress as men in real life for reasons that would include avoiding rape and being able to travel alone, or to practice a profession like Portia, or simply to have adventures. So there was this one famous woman later on in the 17th century, early Stuart period. She was named Mary Firth, and she dressed as a man and walked around London smoking, drinking, and, horror of horrors, she appeared on stage. She did get married, but interestingly, she acted as both a fence, so she bought stolen goods, and she was also a pimp. So she had a really colorful life. She had to go to court for this and was accused of insanity and was eventually put in a hospital, but then let out of a hospital. So she had a very colorful life, Mary Firth, and she walked around London in her trousers, smoking and drinking just like a man. For the most part, offstage cross-dressing was viewed as a prank, and the punishments were often mild. Mostly, it was just to embarrass you. So one woman in 1578 was apparently required to ask for her father's forgiveness before she got communion.